Story and Writing. Review this lecture after reading Chapter 8 Story and Chapter 9 Writing in Understanding Movies. Use the grammar sheet in the Week 10 module to aid in the note-taking process. Journal Question 9. How is the character of Sherry different from the traditional female protagonist in most Hollywood films? Let's remind ourselves of last week's film. Sherry Baby was written and directed by a woman. Let's compare the conventional female protagonist with Sherry. How is she different? I want you to go deep here. We touched on this in the subjective discussion board topic. In our examination of story and writing, we'll start with a screenplay or a script. What information is in the screenplay? The screenplay is the skeleton of the film. The inner thoughts of the characters are often omitted. Screenwriters typically create the dialogue and outline the action in the story. It's not uncommon for screenplays to have multiple authors and to be revised during the filmmaking process. Joe Gillis in Sunset Boulevard makes wisecracks about the role of a screenwriter in Hollywood. Let's explore the difference between a film's story and a film's plot. Believe it or not, they're not the same thing. The story is the general subject matter. It's said that there are only 7 or 8 story archetypes, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle in the 4th century BCE. Plot, how the story is told, the structuring of the scenes in film. The plot is where the magic happens. The director's vision allows the same story to have wildly different plots. Boy meets girl, and this is a very common in film, theater, and literature. It's the story of 500 Days of Summer, our film this week. Romeo and Juliet, a boy meets girl story we're all familiar with. Shakespeare's play has been adapted into film numerous times. Let's examine 2 different versions with the same story, but very different plots. Romeo and Juliet, directed by Franco Zeffirelli in 1968. The director takes a classical approach to the adaptation. This version attempts to recreate the period and the setting of Shakespeare's source material. Romeo and Juliet, directed by Baz Luhrmann in 1996. The director takes a formalistic approach to the adaptation. This version retains the classical story, but modernizes the plot, placing it in a contemporary setting. The 3-story act structure, a classical way to organize the events in a film's story or the film's action. The first act is the first 25% of the film, called the setup. The second act, 50% of the film, the confrontation. And the third act, the resolution, the last 25% of the film. Act 1, the setup. We learn what is the protagonist's goal and what are the obstacles preventing achievement of the goal. The setup makes up the first 25% of the story. Act 2, the confrontation, the middle, the 2/4 of the story. The conflict increases as the protagonist fights against obstacles. Act 3, the resolution, the last 25% of the story, the result of the conflict in Act 2. In classical stories, we may expect a happy ending. Giannetti says, realists prefer loose discursive plots without a clearly defined beginning, middle, or end. Last class we examined realism in Sherry Baby's acting. This week we can apply the elements of realism to Sherry Baby's story. About formalism in story, Giannetti says, formalistic narratives luxuriate in their artificiality. The design of the plot is not concealed, but heightened. 500 Days of Summer, this week's assigned film, typifies a formalistic story. Figurative techniques exist in all methods of storytelling. Giannetti describes them as an artistic device that suggests abstract ideas through comparison, either implied or overt. To simply put it, symbolic meaning is communicated through these figurative techniques. A motif, so much a part of the story that it's almost an invisible symbol. A motif can be a technique or an object. It's something that's repeated and doesn't call too much attention to itself. In the first act of The Graduate, water is a motif. Ben is shown repeatedly in relation to water. The motif communicates symbolic information about Ben's state of mind. Symbols, objects placed in film for the purpose of communicating idea, symbolic meaning. We analyze color symbolism in Homage. The red objects communicate abstract information about the characters. It's possible for red to represent different meanings from person to person. That's perfectly acceptable. Homage, a deliberate reference to another film. Homages can be like a direct quote or paraphrasing. I really want to focus on one film referencing another here. For example, Martin Scorsese pays homage to Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery by referencing or recreating the last shot in Porter's film. When we're reading a book, the point of view may be obvious. Let's think about who's telling the story and point of view of storytelling in film. First person point of view. The protagonist is the narrator in Sunset Boulevard. Joe Gillis tells his version of the story. Consider how the story would be different if it was told from Norma or Max's point of view. Also, consider if Joe Gillis is a reliable narrator. Do we trust him to tell us the truth? Third person or limited narration is relatively uncommon in film. An unseen, non-participating narrator taps into the consciousness of a single character. Typically, the protagonist's inner thoughts and feelings are conveyed. In omniscient narration, the narrator is an all-knowing, unseen part of the story. It's also known as the voice of God. Narrators tend to be detached from the story and can dip into the consciousness of any character. Amelie has this point of view in storytelling. Objective does not enter the consciousness of any character. Objective is the most detached. Objective presents the facts and the viewers are left to interpret them. Objective is a conventional point of view in storytelling in film. Totsie, Sherry Baby, and The Graduate are all examples of objective point of view in storytelling. Literary adaptations. It's very common for literature to be adapted into film. Consider the number of Hollywood films that are adapted in a single year. It may seem simple, but the process is extremely complex. It's difficult to please readers who typically have strong connections to the story and the characters in the source material. Literature into film. 3 types of literature to film adaptations. Loose. An idea, situation, or character is used from the source. Faithful. An attempt to recreate and stay as close to the source material as possible. And literal. Usually restricted to plays and subtler in their modifications. Hollywood adaptations typically fall into the faithful category. Many popular and award-winning films begin as novels, short stories, and even graphic novels. Here are some film adaptation examples: Lord of the Rings, Twilight, Harry Potter, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Shining, Gone with the Wind, and The Wizard of Oz. As an avid reader, I find it challenging to see a movie version of a favorite book They never seem to live up to the source material. This week's assigned film is 500 Days of Summer, directed by Mark Webb in 2009, Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Tom, and Zooey Deschanel as Summer. We have 2 questions to choose from. The first, how is the plot of 500 Days of Summer different from most romantic comedies? Or, how does 500 Days of Summer pay homage to other films? I look forward to reading your response questions. Students are encouraged to explore the films featured in this lecture: Sunset Boulevard, Romeo and Juliet, Franco Zeffirelli, 1968, Romeo and Juliet, Baz Luhrmann, 1996, Sherry Baby, The Graduate, Amelie, The Great Train Robbery, and Goodfellas. You may notice that many of the films featured in this lecture are films we've watched before. I'd like you to return to them if possible. As we develop our aesthetic awareness and our critical evaluation skills, these films will take on a new life every time we view them. Until next time, have a great week.